Untrammeled Approaches by Jacques Maritain, Chapter 11. For an Existential Epistemology, Reflections on Wounded Nature, Nature's Wounds.
In a fundamental text of the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas tells us that in the state of wounded nature, man cannot, by his natural forces alone, accomplish all the good that his nature is capable of. By virtue of his nature, he can carry out many good individual tasks, like building houses and planting vines. If the house he builds happens to be the Parthenon, or if the vine he plants happens to be a great philosophical system, the level to which he was able to raise himself in these goods which are natural to him is certainly worthy of admiration. However, he cannot, without failure, accomplish the entire good that is natural to him. Just as a sick man can have some movement by himself, but cannot move perfectly, like a healthy man, unless he is cured with the help of medicine. If here and there, in what he does, a man arrives at the peak of his natural possibilities, it is because grace, which raises him to the supernatural, has also cured him in the order of his nature. So what is the situation in the case of that eminently human natural activity which we call philosophical activity? St. Thomas did not explain himself on this particular point, and it is precisely this particular point that I would like to address. In the state of nature, where we find ourselves, the philosophy which reason is capable of on its own is incapable, even among the greatest of philosophers, of attaining full natural wisdom, or cannot avoid suffering some deficiency which hobbles it in its eager pursuit of the truth.
Why is there this kind of impotence or wound in reason, or, more exactly, why is reason hobbled this way in its highest speculative function, philosophical wisdom, and metaphysical knowledge? This is a difficult question, on which regarding the famous four wounds, weakness, ignorance, malice, and concupiscence, inflicted on nature by sin, St. Thomas casts some very precious light as general principles guiding research, but which, as far as I know, he has not discussed or treated explicitly. So we are obligated to make the effort ourselves, and to risk a headache from applying to the matter at hand the principles of explanation suggested by him. When he treats the wounds of nature, St. Thomas's perspective is a moral one, and it is from the point of view that they incline toward a moral fault, toward sin, that he looks on these particular wounds. So he tells us that because the will is the principle of moral acts, the inclination to sin is related primarily to the will, in such a way that the wound of original sin affects the will primarily, before passing from it to those powers subject to sin because they are moved to their actions by the will, or after being diverted from those actions, are suppressed by the will. All this is proper, and uniquely proper, to the moral perspective which, as I just said, is St. Thomas's point of view when he speaks of the wounds of nature. But our present point of view is not the moral perspective, or the inclination toward sin. It is a speculative perspective, by which we will examine the wound inflicted on the intelligence. Likewise, we must not forget that when St. Thomas, from the moral perspective, tells us that because of sin, reason is afflicted with a kind of dullness, he takes care to add, especially in actions and the practical order of acts to be accomplished, it follows then that reason is also afflicted by this dullness, at least in certain cases, in the speculative order itself, by the actual sins we commit. Nor let us forget either that St. Thomas clearly indicates that original sin, that is to say, the privation of original grace which affects our human nature in its entirety, the specific nature transmitted to each of us, and which is the cause of the disorder from which our powers suffer. First has its seat in the very essence of the soul, before wounding by this disorder those powers of the soul which are the seat of actual sins. Then St. Thomas, when enumerating the powers that are wounded in this way by original sin, begins with reason, which includes prudence, and whose wound is ignorance. To the extent that it suffers from this wound, reason is deprived of its being ordered to the true. Let us accept this, according to the moral perspective that St. Thomas has taken, with regard to prudential judgment. But from our own present perspective, we must still deal with the fact that reason is likewise wounded by original sin, and deprived as well of its being ordered to the true, in respect to speculative judgment itself, at least when there is a question of attaining the highest and most difficult truths. And the speculative judgment is certainly an act, but it is not a moral act, whose principle is free will. The wounds that reason suffers from among philosophers, in our state of nature, can certainly be due to moral faults, to actual sins which dull their reason. I have in mind a philosopher who, preferring the world of dreams to reality, would give themselves over body and soul to drugs out of love for pleasures of the senses. Or perhaps to another drug, the drug of fashionable ideas or currents of thought sanctioned by public opinion because the hell they have chosen to fear above all others is to be considered of no consequence. But these, after all, are not real philosophers. In the case of real philosophers, and this happens quite often, the wounds of reason may be due once again to the will, if you like, in those obscure powers to which it gives refuge, or to the unconscious pressures of affectivity, which determine their options. In such a case, there may be some form of free consent. Only God knows, at the very outset. But here we are concerned with human weakness, much more than with a moral fault. And then these are not great philosophers. And among these latter philosophers too, and this is what interests us, we find present those wounds from which reason suffers in our fallen nature. In this case, there is neither a question of moral fault, nor of dominant inclinations of the will or of affectivity. It is not in this direction that the truly basic cause of these wounds must be sought. Where then must we seek out the fundamental reason why our intelligence and our reason are more or less wounded by original sin in the speculative order, and wounded to the maximum in their power to attain full natural wisdom? To find the answer to this question, all we have to do, it seems to me, is to transpose what St. Thomas explains to us from the line, or the perspective of the good, to the line, or perspective of the true. What does he tell us, in fact, from his own perspective, the moral perspective? When he asks himself whether or not sin diminishes the good of nature, he distinguishes three entirely different meanings of the expression good of nature. I am going to enumerate them in a different order than he uses. Let me say then that in the first place, there is the gift of original justice, given in the first man to all of human nature. In the second place, there are the very principles of nature, which constitute that nature. And in the third place, there is the natural inclination to virtue. When we move over to our particular perspective, which is no longer a moral but rather speculative one, we will no longer speak of a natural inclination to the good or to virtue, but of a natural inclination to the true.
Through original justice, human nature functioned correctly. This means two things. First, reason perfectly regulated the lower powers of the soul. Second, reason itself was subject to God, held in his hands and perfected by him. This was due to the supernatural gift of grace, not the grace of Christ the Redeemer, but the original or Adamic grace, along with the 3 theological virtues. Let us understand clearly that reason is completed or perfected by grace. This does not mean that through grace, reason is perfected in its nature itself. Rather, grace creates a supernatural heaven in the spirit, where grace resides. This heaven of the soul brings into consciousness the theological virtues and illuminates and fortifies reason in its natural exercise.
Since it is a gift to human nature as such, to the nature of all men to come, this supernatural gift of Adamic grace was indeed a part, and a crucial part, of the good of nature from the very instant of its creation. It was the first good of nature, original justice.
This first good of nature, original justice, was completely taken away by the first sin. The second good of nature, the principles of nature itself, was neither taken away nor diminished by the first sin. Human nature itself and its powers, taken in their essential constitution, are not diminished or intrinsically weakened by the loss of grace, which is a supernatural gift. They were not diminished or weakened by the loss of original justice. Sin does not diminish nature.
The loss of original justice does not diminish the natural inclination to the good, as nature is the root of that inclination. The non-diminution of this inclination to the good, in its radical state in nature itself, does not signify anything particularly brilliant. Even among the damned, the natural inclination to virtue remains. Otherwise, they would have no remorse of conscience. Similarly, even in a blind person, the natural aptitude to see remains, as they are, by their specific nature, an animal having the natural capacity to see. Although this is not much consolation to the blind person, it does explain that they can be cured by a miracle. What is diminished or weakened by the first sin in human nature, transmitted to all men, is the natural ordering toward virtue, not so much as regards its root in the essence of the soul, but rather as regards the state of its development and actualization in the powers of the soul. If this inclination is diminished or weakened, it is not because of some weakness or diminution of internal origin, which would then come from the very nature itself, whereas nature remained intact. It is because of an obstacle or hindrance, such as the sensitive appetite inclining reason and will, causing them to deviate from their order, or depriving them of their proper order. The first good of nature, original justice, in virtue of which reason regulated the lower powers of the soul and was strengthened by God's grace, was totally lost by the sin of our first father. As a result, all the powers of the soul remained deprived of their natural ordering toward virtue, and this deprivation is called the wound of nature. The 4 wounds that come from the hindrance that one power suffers from another that acts upon it.
Here we find ourselves face to face with a disordering, a kind of dislocation or anarchy among the powers of the soul, and a resulting inhibition exercised by one power with regard to another. This disordering is the first effect of the loss of original justice, and this inhibition is the second effect.
The wounds of the intelligence.
We now have all the situations in which we have to make a transposition from the practical perspective, or the perspective of the good, which was St. Thomas's point of view, to the speculative perspective, or the perspective of the true, in order to find a response to the question before us. Through this transposition, we can now treat those wounds inflicted by original sin on reason in its very speculative life, and in its struggle toward natural wisdom, which is the supreme good of that life in which it was created to attain. However, in actual fact,
As a consequence of the first sin, reason cannot attain that natural wisdom fully and without some defect, omission, or irremediable error at the very heart of any system elaborated by a philosopher, however great a philosopher they may be.
Since there is a disordering or loss of control in consequence of which speculative reason is more or less inhibited by the other powers of the soul in its drive toward the true, it becomes clear that wounds or impediments of all kinds can occur, from those which are the result of the most accidental of happenstances. You cannot philosophize when you are seasick, to those which result from the most fundamental of causes, which no one can escape. And these are the ones we are looking for. A philosopher who gives themselves up, body and soul, either to drugs or to that sovereign fear of being poorly regarded, is not a real philosopher. Still, in this completely accidental zone of morally disturbed behavior, there is a kind of hindrance which, because the behavior in question is particularly frequent in our species, runs the risk of wounding the reason even of a real philosopher. I have in mind the miseries of passion and sex which afflict the human being. For example, a life which is constantly troubled by the great tragedies of love, or a life which, out of defiance or anguish, has been voluntarily thrown to the anarchy of the flesh. In such a situation, reason would find itself in a state of dullness. A certain chastity of body and soul is required of a philosopher who wishes to retain the purity of their vision. At the same time, I spoke of the pressures exerted on the intelligence by the affectivity in the obscure powers which haunt the will, and which prevent many real philosophers from becoming great philosophers. I would like to add that there is a particularly typical case, one in which an ego, made all the more dominant, the more it is entangled in its unconscious complexes, seeks to compensate for its frustrations by, and in the system of concepts that it elaborates.
Finally, I pointed out that in the state of nature where we find ourselves, we must turn to the great philosophers in our search for what is truly fundamental and universal with regard to the wounds of speculative reason.
Here we have our task before us. I have done what I could, which is not very much, to move this research forward a bit. The views I am going to lay before you are no more than working hypotheses, but I must confess that I am very much attached to them because if we succeed in creating the tiniest amount of new light in a domain which borders on the upper ranges of metaphysics, this, in itself, would be more important than establishing a television relay station on the moon.
We are no longer in the perspective of the moral good, but in the perspective of the true. We are no longer concerned with the inclination of nature toward virtue, nor with the wounds of nature in this respect, but rather with the desire or the love of the intelligence for the truth, and with the wounds of philosophic thought in this particular respect. It seems to me that we have to take two things into consideration here. In the first place, what I would call the cardinal qualities of the intellect. In the second place, the hindrances or impediments which, in the state of fallen nature, the intellect has to put up with because of something that, due to another power, most intimately concerns its functioning and the activity proper to it.
In the first place, then, I would like to inquire what qualities in the intelligence correspond analogically to the four cardinal virtues in the powers of the soul. It seems to me that the quality of the human intellect, which I will call rational solidity, here the philosopher is a great interconnector of concepts, corresponds to the virtue of prudence, which is found in reason. The quality of the intellect, which I shall call exactness of expression, Here the philosopher declares only what they see, corresponds to the virtue of justice, which is in the will. The quality of the intellect which I will call boldness of vision. Here the philosopher is a great intuitive and a great discoverer, corresponds to the virtue of fortitude, which is in the irascible appetite. Finally, the quality of the intellect which I will call limpidity of thought. Here the philosopher is free of the unconscious pressures and base desires of subjectivity, corresponds to the virtue of temperance, which is in the concupiscible appetite. Here it must be noted that in order to have a great philosopher, all four of these cardinal qualities are necessary. But what above all else makes them great? Naturally supposing qualities number 2, exactness of expression, and number 4, limpidity of thought, is the presence of qualities number 1, rational solidity, and number 3, boldness of vision.
And we must keep in mind, too, that under the influence of that disordering or loss of control produced in each of us by the first sin, it happens inevitably that these qualities of the intellect do not exist together in perfect equilibrium. One is there in excess with respect to another, and vice versa. Why is this so? Because psychological temperaments. Be careful here. By psychological temperament, I do not at all mean the unconscious pressures of subjectivity. I mean the innate constitution of each individual. Not only vary considerably among the different individuals of the species, which is quite normal, but we must keep in mind that under the influence of the disorder or loss of control produced by the first sin, it inevitably happens that the qualities of the intellect do not exist together in perfect equilibrium. One quality may be in excess compared to another, and vice versa. This occurs because psychological temperaments, which I mean as the innate constitution of each individual, vary considerably among different individuals. With the loss of original justice, these temperaments maintain reason in a kind of dependency, and even among the greatest philosophers, their intelligence is subject to the repercussions of their psychological temperament.
We must look at this matter even closer. The hindrances and impediments due to fallen nature affect the intelligence because of something that intimately concerns its activity. This involves the relation between intelligence and imagination, as the latter plays an essential role in the first operation of the mind, which is simple apprehension in the abstraction of the form or idea drawn from the images with the light of the agent intellect. For us, there is no intellection without conversion toward images. What I am trying to say here has nothing to do with the imagining imagination, which, enlivened by the light of the agent intellect in the subconscious of the mind, has created the great myths of humanity. These myths are frequently loaded with errors, but also filled with great truths under forms that are rationally unverifiable.
What I have to say has nothing to do either with the imagination as fancy, against which Malebranche inveighed and called the family idiot of the human mind. The wanderings of fancy play a completely accidental role in regard to philosophy. What I will try to say concerns something far more difficult to express precisely and touches on the very functioning of our intelligence. This disordering or loss of control due to the first sin gave the lower powers of the soul, as St. Thomas said, a certain independence or autonomy, freeing them from the control of reason, proper to the state of original justice. This had an impact on reason itself. From our speculative perspective, the same seems to be the case with the internal sense we call imagination in regard to the intellect which makes use of it. The intellect, by an abstractive operation, draws its ideas from the images it needs essentially, It needs them as simple matter to be illuminated by the agent intellect to bring forth the intelligibles contained within that matter. This essential process undergoes no alteration or diminution. However, it is now parasitized from without. These images, while remaining the matter of the abstractive operation, retain an independent vital energy in the process, attaching themselves to the idea abstracted from them, like a lining or a screen on which the intelligible takes shape. The intelligence pauses on the luminosity of this intelligible, while fixing its gaze on its proper object, and remains unconsciously subject to the vital pressure of the imagination. These remarks refer to a kind of transcendental psychology that has not been much studied but is confirmed by the experience of each individual if they reflect attentively on the clumsiness from which intellection suffers. They are especially confirmed by the analysis of how the mind operates, discernible in the great philosophical doctrines. In the state of nature wounded by the first sin, the images are no longer only a matter which the agent intellect illuminates to draw forth the intelligibles it contains. By means of the idea or concept, once formed and parasitically infested by the images, these images exert a certain impact on the intelligence. This impact is more or less forceful according to the situation and can produce aberrations. Sometimes this impact is weak but still real enough to be an obstacle to the supreme fulfillment of the work of natural wisdom of the intellect, responsible for irreparable omissions. In the state of fallen nature, the philosophical intelligence, when it sets itself to work with all its conceptual equipment, without any help to cure this wound, and without repudiating itself, has a natural inclination to nationalism. This nationalism admits of varied degrees, but acts as an obstacle to the intellectual intuition of being, which is the indispensable condition for attaining philosophical wisdom. Adam, the primitive of humanity's infancy, was endowed with original justice by supernatural grace. He had an intuition of being as a gift of nature. This intuition is natural, and intelligence is made for it. However, it was often overlooked by philosophers, even the greatest ones, throughout history. Aristotle had it only implicitly, and could not fully recognize or use it to enhance his doctrine. It took a theologian with genius and grace to bring this intuition to light by transforming Aristotle's views and focusing on God as being itself, the creator of all. Thanks to this theologian, we have been introduced to this intuition. It is the fundamental natural light of philosophical intelligence, breaking through the barriers of notionalism. In a climate of grace and contemplation, the metaphysics of St. Thomas broke these barriers, leaving a great light to Christian philosophy, accessible to anyone with a good teacher. A contemplative climate may always be necessary to maintain it. It is possible that wise men in non-Christian religions, with the help of grace, have also attained this intuition of being. A few clarifications are needed to make progress. The four cardinal qualities of intelligence vary among individuals due to psychological temperaments. These qualities do not exist in perfect balance in any philosopher. If one quality shines, it tends to overshadow another. Rational solidity, which makes a philosopher a great organizer of concepts, cannot be fully manifest without compromising boldness of vision, which makes a philosopher a great intuitive and discoverer, and vice versa. Let's consider some typical cases. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, had highly developed rational solidity. His philosophy is the work of an admirable conceptual watchmaker, but he set modern philosophy on the path of idealism. Cartesian rationalism is linked to the theory of ideas, considered as the objects of the knowing mind rather than signs through which the mind grasps reality. This theory, which I call the theory of idea pictures, suggests that we know only our ideas, and it is due to divine veracity that things resembling our ideas exist. This theory gave imagination a decisive force over intellect, leading to a lack of intuition of being. Take Hegel, the father of modern philosophy, which has now turned into pure idiosophy in his historical age of miserable consciousness and disintegration. Hegel is a great organizer of concepts and a meticulous watchmaker of reason. He enjoys rational solidity to a formidable degree. However, there are no longer any idea pictures masking realities that resemble them, and through which divine truth guarantees our intellect an indirect grasp on external things. The idea has completely supplanted the thing. This means that the impact of the imagination on the intelligence has become absolute. If the idea has replaced the thing, it is because the phantasm, which parasitically doubles the idea, envelops and reinforces the intelligible brilliance of the idea with all the sensible brilliance due to the vitality and intentionality of the imagination. From that moment on, the idea has completely lost its transparency as a sign. All the value of objectivity, facing up to and imposing itself on knowledge, has passed from the thing to the idea. There is no longer a need for the thing. The idea is sufficient. It is by means of dialectics, the universe of the life and movement of the idea, that the vast universe of a powerfully organized rational system is built up, comes alive, and embraces all, the Hegelian universe of pseudo-wisdom. At the same time, the intuition of being is put under interdict. When Marx put Hegel back on his feet, reality itself would come to live by dialectics. Here too, the intuition of being would be put under interdict.
Now let us turn to an authentic teacher of philosophic truth, our old master Aristotle. We will linger a little longer with him. I am not looking at Aristotle here as the founder of a particular school. Aristotle must be called the great forefather of the perennial philosophy. Here we are dealing with an authentically realist or ontosophic philosophy. In him, that quality of the intellect which is rational solidity reaches its peak. With the exception of St. Thomas, there is no greater organizer of concepts. In him, there is intuitivity and boldness of vision as well. But in this last case, we still find a certain level of deficiency. This is because the impact of the imagination on the intellect, by means of the phantasm, which is that parasitic doubling of the idea, is still present, however feeble it may be. I would say almost at that limit or border where the intelligence might be freed from it. However, this border was never crossed. The immense universe of Aristotle's rational wisdom is a universe of essences grasped by the first operation of the mind, by simple apprehension, undoubtedly centered on being or existence, which, in fact, is there and imposes its primacy, but without being formally grasped. On the contrary, it is present to his thought only in a way that is still blind or virtual, without having been perceived in its full light. In short, Aristotle had the intuition of being in an entirely implicit and virtual mode, as if implied without his knowing it, in the fundamental drive of his realism. He was not able to disengage the intuition of being itself from all the rest, and to make it the vivifying principle of his explicitly formulated doctrine. 3. A digression on the intuition of being, the concept of existence. How can this be explained? Here we must begin a vast digression to give closer consideration to the intellectual intuition of being. With it, we leave the world of simple apprehension and enter the world of judgment. There is a typical characteristic that is absolutely and uniquely proper to this intuition. It is produced in and by an affirmative judgment of existence. I am. Things are. But this judgment, like those others in which a subject endowed with a certain essence is linked by the copulative is to some attribute or predicate grasped by mode of essence, that is, by means of an idea born of the abstractive operation. On the contrary, in the unique case I am talking about, the case of the intellectual intuition of being, the idea or concept of existence does not precede the judgment of existence. It comes after the judgment and stems from it. In this case, we are dealing with a judicative act, the second operation of the mind, which is of a type different from all other judgments. Indeed, it does not apply an attribute to a subject. It is rather the subject itself that this judgment affirms or posits in the mind, as that subject itself is posited outside the mind, in extra mental reality. To produce this judicative act, by really thinking it, is, for the intelligence, in the very heart of the spiritual intimacy of its own operation, to grasp intuitively, or to see, the being, the existence, the extra mental existence of that subject. This is what I call the intuition of being. By means of it, I can plunge into the world of existence and escape from the world of essences and their relationships. It is after this that a return of the first operation of the mind to what has been seen in this way, but not by means of this operation, will produce an idea of it, a concept or a mental word, which will designate it and be manageable in discourse. Then we will have the idea of judicative origin following on the intuition of being, of the existence grasped as such, or of the existence exercised in act outside the mind. As when I say, for example, the soul communicates to the body its own existence or its own being. In other words, in the unique case of the intuition of being, the concept, this concept of existence, formed after I have seen this existence, is second with respect to the judgment of existence in which and through which, by pronouncing it in the intuition, my intelligence saw existence. This concept is due to a reflective return of simple apprehension to the judicative act in question. This is what I will call our second concept of existence.
It is of supreme importance to understand here that this concept is of an entirely different origin in the mind than the concept expressed by the same word, existence, which is produced in the mind, not from a judgment, but from the abstractive operation. In the same way as all the ideas drawn from phantasms by this operation, a concept of existence, which in this case is of abstractive origin, not of judicative origin, and which I will call our first concept of existence. It is unfortunate that the words which signify two different concepts happen to be the same. Existence in the case of the concept of abstract origin, and existence, or the act of existing, in the case of the concept of judgmental origin. This results in the two concepts seeming to relate to the same intelligible object, which is not true at all. For example, when we say, the existence of a spy in our services is indubitable, or when we assert in an entirely different sense, the soul communicates to the body its own existence. Etienne Gilson seems to have been so fascinated by the intuition of being that he wrote that there is no such thing as a concept of existence. Actually, there are two of them, which differ according to their origin in the mind. The first, of abstract origin, belongs to the register of existence, while the other belongs to the register of being. There is a concept of existence, which arises in the mind after the intuition of being, by a turning back of simple apprehension onto that intuition. This happens on a certain level, the level of metaphysical intellection. And there is another concept of existence, which is formed in the mind before the intuition of being has emerged. This other concept of existence is of abstract origin, not judgmental, and it precedes the intuition of being. However, it plays no role in the intuition of being, and remains completely foreign to it. So it is understandable that in many judgments of existence, the concept of existence, previously drawn from phantasms by the abstract operation, has the sole meaning of presence to my world. It is just as understandable that in everyday conversations, even those who have had the intuition of being also use the concept of existence in the vulgar sense. As for example, when they say, "A visitor is here." But when the threshold of a higher form of knowledge has been crossed, an entrance has been made into the realm of philosophy, then some will make use of the concept of existence as a concept due uniquely to the abstract operation. In such cases, even if it remains a useful instrument in the hands of a good metaphysician, it remains an instrument without sufficient power of penetration, and their metaphysics will continue to suffer from a certain deficiency. This will be the object of our final considerations.
Whereas others, who have formally experienced the intellectual intuition of being, will make use of the concept of existence as a concept of judgmental origin, following upon the intuition of being, in other words, as designating an intelligible act of existing, which was not drawn from phantasms by the abstract operation, like all the other objects of concepts.
Let us be careful here, for none of this is easy. In trying to scrutinize the intellectual intuition of being, we find ourselves up against some new questions, which can be answered only by offering new views to make more precise the nature of this intuition. I just said that existence grasped by the intuition of being is an intelligible, which is not drawn from phantasms by the abstract operation. This is the intelligible par excellence, which the intelligence is made to see, but which it sees only in the intuition of being, which is a metaphysical intuition. In everyday conversations, the intelligence does not see this. It is satisfied with the concept of existence as it is offered by the abstract operation, and this on the level of the first degree of abstraction. The eye sees things. It does not know that they are. It is the intelligence which knows that they are. But as long as it remains solely dependent on the abstract operation, it knows this solely in a way that is implicit, and still without having seen being. Something that is the privilege of a metaphysical intuition, unique in its nature. Here we are face to face with a great problem. If the act of existing grasped by the intuition of being is an intelligible, which is not drawn from phantasms by the abstract operation, how does this act of existing, which is material in the things that our eye sees, become proportioned to the intelligence and spiritualized in such a way that the intelligence might come to see it, and see it within itself just as it perceives the essences and the ideas due to the abstract operation? A very delicate analysis is needed here, and this analysis is what I would like to propose to you in these rather hasty notes in which, no doubt, I express myself very imperfectly. But I think I am on the right path.
I think we must distinguish 3 stages, beginning with the perception of external sense, the source of the judgment. Things are, or of consciousness, the source of the judgment, I am. A perception that is indispensable to the intuition of being.
The first stage is the perception of external sense, such as sight. The act of external sense brings within me, by means of a sensible species received from outside, the color of a rose seen by the eye. This means the color of the rose enters the mind through an intentional form, transferring into the sense the way the surface of the petals reflects light, acting on the retina and cerebral center. Simultaneously, it brings into the sense of sight the active existence of the rose, not by a species, but by the intentional action exercised on this sense when it receives the species of the color of the rose.
In the second stage, my intelligence does not need the imagination and its phantasms to know that I see at the moment my eyes see. The intelligence is present in the external sense. It envelops and penetrates with its own life the life of the external sense, developing sensations into perceptions that fall under the grasp of consciousness. The intelligence seizes upon this perception of the sense. It becomes conscious not only of the color of the rose, but also of its seeing that rose. In other words, the cognitive act itself of the external sense. At this moment, the act is transported within itself, or enveloped by it, in a state of intentional doubling. It is there along with the object it perceives. The color of the rose, intentionally received by the sense thanks to the sensible species, and intentionally grasped by the intelligence thanks to the idea, the rose, which I see. The cognitive act of the sense is also there along with the rose's act of existing, made present in the sense of sight by the intentional action it undergoes in receiving the sensible species, and it is made present to the intelligence as implied in the rose which it knows that I see. The thing that I see. A thing that is there.
Here, the intelligence is found on the level of the first degree of abstraction, where it says in its interior word that rose is there. This is the Dasein, such as a Thomas can and must understand this expression. It seems important to note that this Dasein goes with the first degree of abstraction. At this point, the intelligence says that rose is there, or that rose is present to me. It does not say that rose is. This is because the concept at this moment does not yet signify anything more than presence to my world. To be there means only to be declared present, to be given to me as present. This is why a philosophy of the Dasein remains open to idealism. It is only with the intuition of being, with the sane, understood in the Thomistic sense, or the act of existing seen through the intuition of being, our third stage, that metaphysical realism finds a solid foundation. But we are still at our second stage, at the first degree of abstraction, and in the register of the Dasein. At this degree, what about the sane, or the rose's act of existing itself? It is not perceived by the intelligence. At the same time, the intelligence explicitly seizes upon the rose as seen by the eye, and implicitly seizes upon the rose's act of existing, as this is transmitted to the sense by the intentional action it undergoes, and as the intelligence itself declares that I see the rose, or that the rose is there. This is not to see the essence of the rose, but only to know that it is present to me by means of a conceptual substitute, which dispenses it from seeing in the fully intuitive sense of the word. The essence, or the act of existing on the part of the rose, is certainly, in an intentional way, in the intelligence, but in an entirely implicit state, as it is implied, without the intelligence knowing it, in the rose which my intelligence knows that I see, or that the rose is present, in short, in the assertion that rose is there. In this assertion, the judgment that rose is not made. It is possible that the essence may never be discovered, yet it is there, hidden, implied in something else, without the intelligence being aware of the fact. This means that at this first degree of abstraction, the rose's act of existing is already spiritualized, but in proximate potency only, or is potentially contained in another intelligible. In short, as capable, but only capable, itself of becoming proportion in act to the intelligence. It can be made visible to the intelligence and be seen by it, but it is not yet so. It remains hidden to the intelligence.
And now for the third stage. In the instant that the eye sees the rose and the intelligence says, "That rose is there," the intelligence itself passes, as if by a stroke of good fortune, a gift suddenly bestowed by nature, to a higher level. This level is not only at the third degree of abstraction, according to philosophical parlance, but also at a moment of natural contemplation in which thought is freed from abstraction. This can take place superconsciously in a child, before any abstractive operation, and more or less superconsciously in a poet, as it takes place consciously in an apprentice philosopher or in a full-fledged philosopher in the midst of meditation. At this moment, the intuition of being suddenly flashes in the mind like a bolt of lightning. The rose's act of existing, already intentionally present in the intelligence, but only as spiritualized in proximate potency, or as implicitly and blindly contained in the "that rose is there," which the intelligence utters at the first degree of abstraction, is unveiled explicitly now as an object grasped, spiritualized in act, and made proportioned in act to the intelligence. This is brought about not by means of some species or intentio intellecta or other, but by means of an intentio intelligence. I mean by an act, this time a judicative act, which, positing the rose within the mind as it is posited in itself outside the mind, at one and the same time, brings the rose's act of existing to a state of spirituality in act and makes the mind see. It is this very judicative act, affirming the rose's act of existing outside the mind, which, inside the mind, makes it visible to and seen by the intelligence in the very instant when it says, "That rose is," that rose exists, with the entire plenitude of meaning in the word to be, or to exist.
The intelligence sees being, the being of this or that, in the judgment of existence, unique in character, which it brings to bear at that instant. The affirmation of existence, on the level of the first degree of abstraction, in reality remains a copulative assertion of presence to my world. Paul is there. Paul is present, in which the attention of the mind is concentrated above all on the subject as present. Paul is there. On the contrary, however, the affirmation of existence, on the level of the third degree of intelligibility, Paul is a purely existential affirmation, in which the attention of the mind is concentrated above all on the verb. This is why in uttering this assertion, the intelligence experiences a kind of revelation of the being possessed by things, of extramental being, which sweeps away, with a single stroke, any temptation to idealism. It is on the chance occasion when some individual reality is grasped in its singularity by the external sense. A tree, a bird, the calm ocean, a humble little hill, or the glance of a loved one or a smile, or the gesture of the hand which passes in the instant and will never return. Or on the occasion when, at some privileged moment, my consciousness seizes upon the act of existing, of that secret and hidden reality, but eminently mine, which is myself. It has happened to me on occasion, a sudden intuition, to experience the reality of my being, of that profound principle, the very first, which places me outside of nothingness. A powerful intuition whose violence sometimes frightened me, and which was the first to give me some knowledge of a metaphysical absolute. It is, as I said, on the occasion of some individual reality grasped in its pure singularity that such an intellectual intuition of being is produced. But at the same time, and by the same process, for in seeing that this rose is, I recognize at the same time that outside my mind there are as well, each one in its own particular way, a multitude of other things. It is being itself that is revealed to the intelligence, in the mystery of its limitless horizon, and of the irreducible diversity with which it posits before us each single existent. This is why it is precisely by the intuition of being, as formally given to the intellect, that the latter perceives the analogy of existence in the fullness of its meaning. What I want to say is that at this point, the intellect perceives not only that the concept of being in itself is intrinsically varied, analogy of proper proportionality, just like the concept of all the transcendentals, but also that the analogy of being is the reason, in the key of the analogy of the transcendentals, and that this analogy crosses the boundaries of the infinite. If each one of the diverse existents is good in its own way, or one in its own way, it is because each one exists, or is posited for its own sake, and in its own way, outside the mind, and after all is said and done, precisely because there is a self-subsistent existence, known to us analogically, even though infinitely above our grasp, in which and with which all the other transcendentals, also raised to pure act, must be absolutely identified. Dasein and sane.
I would now like to propose some more general considerations on the analogy of being and the concept of existence. We have seen that there are two concepts of existence, one formed at the first degree of abstraction, or intelligibility, and the other at the third degree, in a mind that has experienced the formal intuition of being.
I have emphasized the difference in origin between these two concepts. The first is due to the abstractive operation and drawn from phantasms, through the light of the agent intellect. The second, on the contrary, is due to a return of simple apprehension on the intuition of being, and the judicative act in which it is produced.
Next, I insisted on the difference in meaning between these two concepts. Although the object of the first concept of existence is evidently not an essence, it is nevertheless, like every concept of abstractive origin, grasped and conceived by mode of essence or in the manner of a quality.
On the one hand, it is formed on the level of the first degree of abstraction, and subsequently remains enclosed within the sphere of sensible experience and the world in which we live. It is its belonging to this world, or its presence to this world, that is designated here. It follows from these two facts that the assertion of existence here is in reality a copulative assertion in which a subject is declared present to my world.
When we speak of the existence of something on this particular level, it is to declare that thing is present or presently given. In other words, that thing is there. We are in the register of the Dasein, which goes with the first degree of abstraction or intelligibility. And to be there is to be present to our world, to the sensible world. Consequently, being, or rather what holds the place of being in the mind, is conceived and used in discourse by univocal mode. The concept of existence is an analogous concept in itself, but now it is no longer anything except the concept of presence to my world. When the greatest of metaphysicians says in the ordinary conversations of daily life, "Pass me my inkstand, it is there," or "Tell Reginald to come in, he is there," they are quite simply using the notion of existence as Dasein. They are using it in a univocal mode. On the contrary, when we come to the second concept of existence, the one which precedes the intuition of being, we are in the register of the sane, which goes with the third degree of intelligibility. Here, the assertion of existence is not copulative, but a properly existential assertion of the act of existing. Here being is grasped as such, in its own light, which is a revelation to the mind within the mind of the extra mental act of existing. It is no longer taken in its relation to the sensible world. It is taken absolutely, in its limitless and intrinsically differentiated universality, which embraces everything that is.
Consequently, being, which is analogous by its nature and grasped as analogous, is now conceived and used in discourse by analogical mode. The concept of existence, then, is an analogical concept taken analogically. This is the privilege of the sane.
In addition, it seems important to remark that what I have just said about existence must be said as well of the existent or being. It is fashionable today to oppose being to the existent. This is a mistake. A being or an existent is quite clearly a subject which exists or possesses existence.
So there are two different meanings to the word being. In the first sense, it refers to the Dasein and to the level of the first degree of abstraction, where the assertion of existence is reduced to the copulative assertion, that thing is present to my world, that thing is there. In the second sense, the word being refers to the sane and the level of the third degree of intelligibility. And as we have seen, the assertion that thing is endowed with existence, far from constituting the primordial assertion of the act of existing. That thing is, comes after the primordial assertion of the act of existing. It is a return on this latter assertion, just as the concept of existence is a return on the judicative act in which the intuition of being occurs. But the assertion declaring that a subject is endowed with existence and is, in short, an existent or a being is surely legitimate. Once I've had the intuition of extra-mental being and have formed the concept that corresponds to it, then evidently I can say that such a subject as I know to exist, or whose existence I affirm is endowed with existence, or that it is an existent or a being.
I would like now to take up once again my remarks on the concept of existence, on the level of the first degree of abstraction, which is also that of the Dasein. On this level we find three distinct kinds of function of the intelligence, depending on whether we are concerned with the ordinary conversations of daily life, or with the natural sciences, or with the philosophy of nature. In the ordinary conversations of daily life, the words to be, in such assertions as Paul is here, mean that Paul is present. These assertions use to be purely as a linking verb. It is the presence of Paul that is meant to be affirmed, carrying the entire existential meaning. Here we see the confusion from which the word Dasein must be clarified.
As contemporary philosophers descended from Hegel have forged it, being there, Dasein, where sane upstages da, suggesting to exist there, appears as an inferior kind of act of existing, qualified by the there, which diminishes and falsifies it. It is a pseudo-existence, a spurious or botched-up act of existing that tries to pass itself off as true being, leading us down a misleading and fatal path in search of true being. With such a pseudo-notion of the act of existing, the mind cannot help but wander astray into the realm of cheap philosophical imitations and illusions of lofty speculation. Dasein does not offer a first approach to being, even a deceptive one. It is a substitute for being, not because it presents an existence there, which would be a spurious, defective existence. It is a substitute for being because it presents a being predicated or declared there, meaning a there, that alone bears the existential meaning.
In such assertions, the word sane, far from signifying to exist, to exercise the act of existing, is really no more than the verb to be, used as a simple link, applying the predicate there, or da, to a subject. In other words, Dasein is a substitute for being because, on the level of the first degree of abstraction, existence is no more than presence to my world attributed to a subject, connoting the act of existing only by implication. Because of this, thought is dispensed from thinking to exist, while still designating it implicitly. Here we have the correct notion of Dasein, or being there, where the word being in no way signifies the act of existing and has no more than a linking meaning. If, in the context of Dasein, as correctly understood, some other meaning reinforces the linking sense by emphasizing the affirmation, the new meaning will be the inevitability of the there, or the presence in question. This presence imposes itself on me, taking its place irrevocably in my world. Paul is there. If I find this too annoying, I can always reply, I am not there for him.
Hence, the concept of existence, which is analogous in itself, as well as for the metaphysician, but in this case, is no more than the substitute concept of presence to my world, is used in a univocal way. Whatever I happen to be talking about, I declare it to be there in this same way, and with the same mode of signification. The same is the case with the second type of the functioning of intelligence on this level, characteristic of the natural sciences. If I think, the plesiosaurus no longer exists, I mean nothing more than that the plesiosaurus is no longer a part of the terrestrial fauna. It is no longer there in the midst of this fauna. If a chemist successfully synthesizes insulin, at the end of the operation, they can say, finally, we have insulin. There it is. In this assertion, what reinforces the purely linking meaning of the word to be is scientific certainty, which has nothing to do with the ordinary conversations of daily life. The concept of existence or being there is once again used in a univocal way. Now, what about the third type? Characteristic of the philosophy of nature. I refer to a philosophy of nature that, hypothetically, would be limited purely and simply to the first degree of abstraction, accompanied by no metaphysical understanding whatsoever in the philosopher's mind. This philosopher would not experience the intuition of being, even virtually, or through some substitute for being that would then turn their doctrine awry. We would still be in the realm of Dasein, but this time understood philosophically, in an explanation or knowledge claiming to be ultimate or fundamental in character. In dialectical materialism, we have an example of such a philosophy of nature, in a sense entirely different from Aristotle's meaning. It seems interesting to bring 2 points to your attention. On the one hand, though Hegel has been reinstated as the intellectual inspiration and doctrinal guide of Marxist realism, and, from the outset, prey to a parasitical idealism, logic has become the soul of the real. Instead of being ontological as it should be, the philosophy of nature is now dialectical. What reinforces the purely linking sense of the word to be in the assertion of being there is this very dialectical process, proper to secondary intentions, movement, oppositions, and syntheses in its internal discourse. On the other hand, praxis, or transitive action, has taken on an absolutely primary and fundamental value in this philosophy, to the point of completely replacing speculative knowledge. Consequently, to be has become to do, or to act. This means that, besides the dialectical, a second matter for thought, namely making or doing, reinforces the purely linking sense of the word to be, in the being there associated with the first degree of abstraction. With these two philosophical reinforcements, the dialectical and making, or doing, the assertion of existence remains more than ever the assertion of Dasein. The concept of existence, now no more than the concept of presence to my world, is used more than ever in a univocal way. After this, it can be noted that those philosophers who have no experience of the intuition of being can still claim to do metaphysics and think they are metaphysicians. This can happen even to Christian philosophers when they become infatuated with idealism or phenomenology. These philosophers use concepts that belong to the third degree of abstraction, but they do not understand the meaning of analogy. This means that their method of thought does not rise above the level of the first degree of abstraction, hence above the level of existence. They can affirm the existence of God, but this existence is an alienated or extrapolated form of existence from the world of sensible experience, a sublimated existence. God exists now means God is there in the invisible, but he is now a datum of faith, which escapes any proof that reason can offer. These philosophers use the notion of being or existence in a univocal way. It is possible for a particular philosopher to be obsessed with the desire to attain being without ever having the slightest intuition of being or understanding what metaphysics is. They struggle within and against existence, doing all they can to escape it, but without success. They have no desire to construct a philosophy of nature, yet they stir about in this sphere with a dizzying display of concepts of their own invention, without bringing any light to this sphere by the slightest degree of metaphysical understanding. A kind of natural mysticism plays the part of a stand-in for metaphysics. More than ever, they use the concept of being in a univocal way, mistaking being as univocal in itself. This philosopher is very much like Heidegger.
The intuition of being when it is only virtual.
When it comes to the intuition of being, everything I just said was related to the level of the first degree of abstraction in the perspective of existence. Let us leave that behind and turn to metaphysics. Let us move from existence to being, from the level of the first degree of intelligibility to the level of the third.
There are some philosophers who, without being St. Thomas or one of his great disciples, are true metaphysicians but seem to be lacking something. These are real metaphysicians. They use concepts of the third degree of abstraction, or intelligibility rather than the first. They are placed within the third degree of intelligibility and metaphysical intellection, and they have a real sense of the analogy of being. However, their sense of the analogy of being is still incomplete and deficient because they have not had the formal intuition of being in its full light. This was the case with Bergson, who experienced the intuition of being in a disguised fashion, or by means of a substitute, i.e., duration, from which his metaphysics suffered a doctrinal deviation. His sense of the analogy of being was also in disguise. And what about Aristotle? He's the one I wanted to get to. He had an admirable sense of the analogy of being, unlike Bergson, but it was still incomplete. Aristotle had a real experience of the intuition of being, but not in full light, only virtually. His metaphysics did not suffer from doctrinal falsification, but it did suffer from a serious omission. He was incapable of a formal experience of the intuition of being because his metaphysics was limited by his notionalism, despite his realist approach. This was due to the impact of the image on the intellect in our fallen and disordered nature. Aristotle never got beyond the wall of essences, he conceived the essence itself in the same way he conceived other transcendentals, by an authentically metaphysical concept. However, this perspective was still partially blocked and not completely liberated. This Aristotelian concept of essence is a third concept of existence. The first concept is due to the abstractive operation at the first degree of abstraction, remaining within the register of presence to my world. The second concept is due to a return of simple apprehension to the judicative act, producing the intuition of being. The third concept of existence is a metaphysical concept, formed at the third degree of abstraction. This third concept of existence is an intelligible that implies no limitation to the world of sensible experience. It stands in no relationship to the sensible world and is not reduced to presence to my world. This intelligible is the very essence itself. But the concept is not due to a turning back to the intuition of being. It is a concept of abstractive origin, presenting the intelligized object in the manner of an essence. In theory, Aristotle was a great metaphysician, but his intuition of being remained virtual. He taught that essence is distinguished from potency, but he conceived essence itself in the manner of an essence or quality. He could not think of it otherwise because it was presented to him by a concept of abstractive origin. Visualized in this way, existence becomes an act just like any other, in the same way that understanding is the act of the intellect. Aristotle clearly saw that there is an analogy between the statements, existence actuates the essence, and understanding actuates the intelligence. However, he did not see the significant difference between these two assertions. In the second, understanding is the act of the intelligence. Understanding is said to be the act of a certain essence considered as existing. In the first assertion, existing is the act of the essence. It refers to an act by which an essence that was nothing is brought into existence. This is the assertion of an irreducible absolute, a kind of miracle of nature, which in reality supposes the action of God the Creator, who gives being to everything that is.
If visualized as Aristotle did, existence becomes a transcendental like the others, such as the good, the one, and the beautiful. Its absolute privilege, which is to be the king of the transcendentals, will remain hidden from view and will be known only virtually. This privilege is one with the fact that the analogy of being is the reason and the key to the analogy of the transcendentals. To have known this only virtually, without being able to use it in his explicitly formulated thought and doctrine, is one of the signs of Aristotle's limitations. This shows that his perspective, even though it was that of being, remained partially obstructed.
Aristotle might have known that being and good are convertible. The more being something has, the more good it has, and conversely. But he did not realize that the absolute identity between being and the other transcendentals, just as between being and the intelligibles, such as understanding and love, which of themselves imply no imperfection, is found only in an existence of infinite transcendence, existence itself subsisting. Aristotle knew that God is pure act in the thought of thought, but Aristotle's thought of thought knows itself without at the same time knowing all other things, because it does not create them, and this pure act remains the prime mover of the universe. Aristotle did not realize that God is the creator of being, because he did not realize that he is being itself, subsisting through itself. In short, however nobly Aristotle speaks of God in his metaphysics, he does not reach him in the constitutive elements of his metaphysics. Analogically, he does, of course, through a glass darkly. It is his physics far more than his metaphysics that reveal to Aristotle the proofs of God's existence. This is all to the honor of Aristotelian physics. His philosophy of nature, like any philosophy of nature worthy of the name, is a knowledge founded on the level of the first degree of abstraction. But it is an ontological knowledge, which has escaped from existence and is concerned with being itself. This knowledge, and the concepts it uses, are illuminated by the mind of the philosopher and endowed with a meaning that is participatively metaphysical or significative of being, through the metaphysical understanding which the philosopher brings into play at the third degree of intelligibility, which supposes the intuition of being, even if it is there only virtually, as is the case with Aristotle. The fact that the Aristotelian philosophy of nature is crowned by the demonstration of God's existence is the sign of its full philosophical authenticity. But this glory of his physics was purchased by him at the cost of an irreparable omission in his metaphysics, the omission of the intuition of being formally received and possessed, and by a defect in his metaphysics just as irreparable, I mean in his very doctrine, insofar as it has not been entirely recast. In his metaphysics, the analogy of being was seen, but only incompletely. It remains half-hidden. It is not grasped in its full dimensions. To grasp it in its fullness was the achievement of St. Thomas, not of Aristotle. This is what I wanted to tell you about the metaphysics of the greatest of philosophers, whose work was accomplished in our condition of fallen nature through the powers of human reason, all by itself. My remarks undoubtedly remain quite imperfect. I would like to have gone back to all that Etienne Gilson has written on the subject of Aristotle's notionalism, but I did not have the time to do so, putting together these notes as hastily as I did. I hope these remarks are nevertheless sufficient for my purpose. The same can be said about the whole of the present work that I am submitting to you. It is a work in draft form and very imperfect. But, as I said to you once before, I think it is on the right track. To complete my exposition, we must now discuss the concept of being in its entirety, at the highest level of metaphysical thought. This is achieved through the intuition of being, fully understood and formally possessed, in a comprehensive view of the analogy of being. Here, I can only refer you to the metaphysics of St. Thomas, which represents the pinnacle of human intelligence, as described by Etienne Gilson, and can be found in his two summas. It is important to read this attentively, due to the Aristotelian language that St. Thomas humbly used. However, this does not prevent his own thoughts from emerging in enlightening flashes. This careful reading is especially necessary when considering the great commentators, particularly Cajetan, who, despite his genius, was more influenced by Aristotle, and could not, as St. Thomas did so admirably, free himself from Aristotle's conceptual framework.
4. The epistemological status of exegesis.
My initial intention was for the reflections I just shared to serve as the starting point for a more extensive work, dedicated to exploring what might be called a concrete or existential epistemology. At the end of this work, I hope to define the epistemological status of exegesis. However, I fear that completing such an undertaking is beyond my capabilities. At my age, one must accept that it is often only possible to open doors and take a few steps forward, hoping that others, better equipped, will continue to clear the path. Nevertheless, I will briefly outline a few guiding ideas, still in rough form, that I have glimpsed regarding this subject. I do not believe that the epistemology of exegesis has been adequately considered or treated by those responsible for teaching the critique of knowledge. As a result, exegetes lack a precise understanding of the proper status of their work within the universe of human knowledge. This is a deficiency that needs to be addressed.
It seems to me that exegetes today often view their discipline as a type of positive science, which can and should be established independently of theology, and for some, even separate from faith itself. In my opinion, this is an illusion. Exegesis employs a scientific apparatus drawn from various disciplines: linguistics, semantics, semiology, comparative grammar, paleography, archaeology, etc., not to mention history, which, while not a science, provides us with certain facts. However, this does not mean that exegesis itself is a positive science, or that it operates on the same level as modern science, which relies on empirical verification.
The idea that exegesis, using information from diverse sciences and disciplines, along with some explanatory hypothesis, constitutes an autonomous science capable of providing the exact meaning of a sacred text is, I believe, illusory. Authentic exegesis attains its status as true knowledge only when it uses its scientific tools in the light of higher truths, specifically the virtue of faith, and an accurate understanding of the divine and human realities related to the sacred text. In other words, it must operate in the light of theological wisdom. Thus, I believe that exegesis, as an authentic form of knowledge, is situated not on the level of positive science, but on the level of wisdom, akin to theology. It is here, presupposing and aligning with theological knowledge, that exegesis can achieve the certainties and well-founded hypotheses proper to true knowledge.
We have some excellent exegetes today.
However, it seems that most of them continue to believe, along with their less capable colleagues, that their discipline is situated on the level of science,
positive science, and not of wisdom. If we question them about their discipline, they would likely say that in establishing the meaning of a sacred text, they are using a positive science based on purely factual research. Yet they are not entirely satisfied with this answer, because they know very well, through their own work, that exegesis as they practice it is guided by the habit of theological faith present in their minds. They might add that exegesis should be completed by and in theology, even though exegesis does not presuppose the light of theology, or that this positive science is an instrument of theology regarding its initial data, just as philosophy is with regard to its doctrinal synthesis. All this is inadmissible in a healthy epistemology. If a positive science has already determined the meaning of a sacred text by its own methods, it could not be the instrument that theology would use to establish its initial basis. In such a case, one would have to say that the positive science in question furnishes theology with the initial basis, already determined by that positive science, on which theology will be established. In other words, this positive science instructs the theologian in the first truths the theologian needs to know. Far from being simply an instrument of theology, this positive science becomes its monitor and teacher. The malaise from which the mind suffers here comes from the fact that exegesis itself and the sciences or scientific equipment it uses have been confused in a concept that makes it seem self-evident that exegesis is no more than another positive science, which is not the case at all. The truth is that, in its true nature, exegesis is a form of wisdom that uses scientific equipment in the light of theological knowledge and presupposes that knowledge.
Why then are those I mentioned excellent exegetes? It is because they have a firm, ardent faith that animates and vivifies all the work they accomplish with the help of their scientific equipment. This compensates for their neglect of the theological lights normally required for such work, a neglect that is sometimes more apparent than real. sometimes real but partial, and sometimes real and total. It could also be said that, in the case of any exegete worthy of the name, faith introduces many rays of these lights. The exegetes I am referring to act in this way in their actual operation, which is quite different from the way they think they act according to a theoretical idea accepted and commonly held by them. If my remarks are accurate, they make more manifest the need for our conscious reflection on a clearly established epistemological status for exegesis. The sole object of exegesis is not to establish critically, among its various variants, the text proposed for our reading. This is no more than a preliminary task in which scientific equipment is king. The object of exegesis is to sort out for us the meaning this particular text transmits to us, the meaning of sacred scripture. This is an entirely different matter. It suffices for us to give the proper weight to this expression, to furnish us the meaning of what God is telling us through the instrument of human language, for us to see why I said that exegesis is to be placed on the same level as theology, in such a way that it presupposes and concurs with theological knowledge. What does this mean, if not that exegesis itself is a part of theology? It seems to me that it would be to our advantage to renew our vocabulary with all due freedom, and to recognize for an exegesis restored to its true nature the name of scriptural theology. This would lead to the distinction in theology between not just two parts, positive theology and speculative theology, but rather three parts. The first being exegesis itself, or scriptural theology. The second, the theology which might be called patristic and conciliar, with a historical perspective. And the third, speculative theology, with the perspective of the deposit of revelation as such. Each part of supreme wisdom uses naturally and rationally ordered tools, which should be good, valid, and truthful in their own order. The tools of scriptural theology or exegesis come from empirical sciences or disciplines. These tools are somewhat distant from the wisdom that uses them, similar to how a tool in an artisan's hand is distant from their head or brain. Metaphorically, it could be called a kind of manual tool.
The tools of patristic and conciliar theology are also manual tools when establishing historical data. However, these forms of theology are directly concerned with the object or contents of theological wisdom itself. The tools of speculative theology are closely connected to the elaboration of theology. Speaking metaphorically, I would call these tools cerebral. Here we find wisdom, philosophical, metaphysical wisdom, essentially founded in truth, and instrumentally used by theological knowledge. It is not surprising that the three parts of theological wisdom develop together, interacting and evolving mutually, each presupposing and contributing to the growth of the others, like parts of a living organism. Finally, these three parts of theology, a wisdom of supernatural reason at its root, could be represented by a circle closed on itself, the ancient symbol of the serpent biting its own tail. Suppose our pen starts at a point, rises to the left, descends to the right, and ends up joining the starting point. At the circle's starting point, we place scriptural theology, which will gradually rise to higher levels of perfection, along with the other parts of theology. Higher on the circle, at an ascending point, we place patristic and conciliar theology. At a symmetrical descending point, we place speculative theology, where the circle closes, where the serpent bites its tail. We return to scriptural theology, now as the ultimate endpoint of the entire movement. Meditation on the Holy Scriptures, in that devout turning inward of study which gradually changes into prayer, appears as the ultimate and delightful fruit of the entire wisdom of theology. The work of the exegete or scriptural theologian, which begins on an earthly level, finds its completion through the contemplative gaze in the heaven of the soul, where the sacred text is savored in its divine content.
All of this needs to be discussed, clarified, and carefully supported. This would be a new work, centered on the current state of exegetical research. It is also necessary to tackle the whole problem of hermeneutics and the philosophical bases involved. Today, let me propose some approaches, certainly with necessary modifications, for a more profound reflection.